Grateful good morning to our Caron YouTube audience and also to our in-person audience and to those around the campus. I know we have maybe a few more than we customarily do who are watching on live stream. So happy to have the opportunity to be in front of you, and there's a concurrence of circumstances and topics, which is customary for the Caron Chapel service. Our singer just let you know the topic for today is hope. And the message for today occurs on the 3rd of July, 2022. And it occurred to me to start with something I learned many years ago. Those of you who have heard a lecture I give once every 4 weeks or have been in my care because it leaks out in other places might know the thing that I'm passionate about is study of and connecting the notion of epic or quest as a form of literature with the experience of people who are on recovery journeys. And I like to think of recovery as an epic journey. And in fact, the dad of our granddaughter says, that's one of his favorite words, dude, that's epic. So, and every time he says it, I think about Joseph Campbell, but, and I don't think he means it in that way entirely, but my favorite of the huge body of epic literature, you might think I was about to say the Iliad or the Odyssey or something like that, but my favorite is J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And when I was a boy, I read hardbound editions of that my mom bought for me every summer. And so way before Peter Jackson movies, I was a Lord of the Rings nerd. And I still today am a Lord of the Rings nerd. And so when the movies came out, I was sure they were going to be awful, but I was enthralled with them. And then after the movies came out, I bought the extended edition super package with all of these DVDs. And I have not watched all of them. The amount of material on them is just absurd. But I did learn something from some additional material on one of these. God knows how many DVDs are in the little binder. What I learned was that Tolkien was a young soldier in the First World War, and that he served in foxholes where all around him, there was largely at that time, there was still a lot of individual person-to-person combat. And yes, there were bombs, and yes, there was more a distance sort of war. War has changed since that time, the early part of the 20th century, where today we can use drones and sort of have a very different, I think, experience of what war is like. I don't mean it's any less horrible, but what I thought of as I was preparing for the message today was Tolkien. And what I learned about Tolkien was that the very first indications of his envisioning of this land that would be called Middle Earth came in his journal in the foxhole in World War I. So he had drawings of bizarre mystical creatures, elves and orcs and all that sort of stuff, which would become the elves and orcs that many of you know from that material, whether you learned it in the movies or the books. But it came out of a situation in which, first of all, there was misery and death all around him. And my guess is that hope seemed quite distant, at least at moments. And that he didn't have recourse to afternoon tea or a good bit of scotch or a pint, which I'm guessing as a good Brit would have been things that he missed in the foxhole. I don't know what his relationship with alcohol was, but I'm assuming if he was like many of his contemporaries and wasn't one of us, that would have been part of his coping repertoire. So here in the midst of despair encroaching and death around him, and without the creature comforts of the fireplace and afternoon tea, Tolkien does something that I think is very human, which is he doesn't have hope immediately accessible to him right there, but he projects a world in which others struggle against seemingly insurmountable odds, but ultimately experience triumph and victory. He hopes in dark circumstances. Chapter 2. My stepson is this weekend serving in the U.S. Coast Guard, guarding one of the harbors and maritime security for a national celebration. I was saying my own prayers for him this weekend because what I remember, this is embarrassing but true, I remember going out on the boat and observing fireworks from the water being completely tanked. And the Coast Guard never pulled me over, but they probably should have. And I think sadly, the reason I was out there was more for the booze cruise experience than I was for the celebration of our national hope. But I don't want to get myself mired in politics or offend anyone, but I will say that I'm afraid for our country. And I'm afraid because every time I wake up in the morning and I put on the local news here, I hear about some other street shooting in Philadelphia. I'm watching, like all of us are experiencing, my wallet's power dwindle. I'm perplexed by a legislative branch of government that for more than a decade has largely been incapable of doing what I used to see it do, which was actually legislate. And underlying that, I have this fear. It's not foxhole fear. I am not like, oh my God, there is national death on the left and right of me, but I'm plagued by worry about our national hope and future. And I am moved by the concurrence of the theme and the weekend to share with you a story that ties Caron with this. So I came to Caron in 2008, which is a long time to have served here. Really grateful for that. And by 2009 to 2010, I think in the first 2 years, I had 5 bosses, which people told me was a bad sign. I was going to be fired shortly. Haha. But you didn't laugh. Okay, anyway, I did. I had 5 supervisors in 2 years. And it was making me nervous because I was like a hot potato, apparently. Also, in the midst of this parade of different supervision, what happened was I came at a time of significant organizational change. So there were new programs and there were new leaders and there was a cultural anxiousness in the organization. And there were people who had been part of Caron for longer who were actually really terrified for the future of Caron. And they were like, Caron is losing its soul, and Caron is selling out, and Caron is not going to be what it ever has always has been. And I heard those voices, but there were a couple of people who were important for me in that time because they said to me, Jack, remain calm. The folks who are panicking have not been here long enough to see what these wisdom keepers had seen. And they bore witness to this thing, which they called like the spirit of Magic Mountain. And they said, you know what? Caron has this funny way when change sweeps in of doing one of two things. Either integrating the change in new and improved ways of doing what we do, or spitting it out. And I saw that happen. I'm thinking about a couple of things, including a couple of people. I'm not going to name them aloud because who knows who watches on YouTube. But I watched that happen. I watched a couple of changes emerge in my first few years here that were integrated, and I would say today are still here and have improved our care. And I watched a couple of people and changes get spit out. And what I was told, in fact, by one person who was especially sort of epic, mythical, kind of my thinker sort of person, that it was, their way of thinking about that was that the spirit of Dick and Caron was still here on this mountain. And that it would, their hope was that it would never leave. And that the essence of that spirit was love and excellence. That Father Bill used to talk about that. Mediocrity is not an option, that we would do what we do for the very best out of the love of our mission and the desire to help families heal, individuals find recovery, and addiction be vanquished. So I put those two together because my decision about this internally is to decide to be that hopeful about our national celebration this weekend. And I'm going to allow myself to believe that whatever needs to be integrated, we will integrate, because I think there are a lot of changes that are bringing a lot of this tension, that are just surfacing of old things that have been here for a long time, but they've been suppressed. That's a dangerous thing to get me in trouble, but I don't mean to offend anybody. And then I also think that there are things that we will not retain, and that the unbelievable experiment of this democracy will survive. And that what Jared is out there on the water protecting will persist and shine. Chapter 3. You don't come to this YouTube channel or to this auditorium without having been affected by addiction. And addiction is a nasty thing. Today it's called a use disorder, but I like the word addiction. It's kind of raw and pure and makes better sense to me in a way than, I mean, I'm happy to have it medicalized. I think it's important for it to be medicalized, but you're here because it's the foxhole that you have fallen in, or the foxhole that you have a loved one fighting in. And there is death to the left and right. There is person-to-person combat. And there is questionable outcome. And to play the terror side of it for half a second before we move to the hope side of it, you know, fentanyl, the most cruel of the substances in play at the moment, is now showing up in stuff I did. I was not much of an opioid user, especially in my active addiction, but I snorted a lot of cocaine. And I know of a number of deaths of cocaine ingested through the nose that has killed people because fentanyl is being used as a substitute in there without people knowing what they're doing. So and I often like to say that the cost of addiction should not be measured in deaths alone, because the cost of addiction should be measured in broken marriages, and lost careers, and lost jobs, and lost hopes. I mean, you can lose a lot and be miserable and addicted and still breathing. So we should count that too. We should be upset about the way addiction is affecting our lives and our society, not just based on mortality, but, to use the correct term here, morbidity, the erosion of the quality and safety and substance of a person's life and a family's life. So, what I learned in my addiction recovery, which has been largely empowered through the 12 steps, though today I've learned that our recovery will do better if we support people in choosing the path that is safest and most comfortable for them. So I think there are other options today than 12 steps, and I'm an advocate for them as well. But what I learned through my successive marches through the 12 steps, not just once but multiple times, is that, first of all, it's taken me a great deal of time to acquire competency in the steps as a form of the language of recovery. And that there's something in the digging into the pain, like digging into the foxhole, is in the middle steps. What I heard, I just was at a meeting on Friday night, and somebody said the first 3 steps get you sober, and the last 3 steps help keep you sober, and the middle steps will determine the quality of your sobriety. Really important and powerful thought. I would say when I heard that on Friday night, I was like, I think that is spot on. because I think I know people who use 1, 2, 3, and 11 and 12 to sustain a fairly, less than exuberant recovery. But that there's a path to transformed existence, feeling of spiritual awakening, whole new attitude and outlook on life, the promises become fulfilled, all that stuff. For those of you who know the language of the 12 steps, I'm starting to quote basically from the literature. And that only happens if you undertake this epic middle part of the quest. And as you dig into it, if you look at it in the classic way, one of the things, I don't mean to get too teachy here, but I'll try to get back to the hope issue, is that Bill Wilson, as he imparted the initial explanation of how the 12 steps worked by the initial folks, the people who were doing it, put fear at the top of the agenda. So when you would do your 4-step inventory, fears were one of the things you inventory, but also when you looked at what underlied your resentments and underlied your sexual history, selfishness, dishonesty, and lack of consideration for others were key pieces, but the other piece of it would be fear. And in fact, on page 65 of the AA Big Book, there's this famous kind of humorous chart. If you pay attention to it, it's got some irony in it. But at the end of the chart, there are little bracketed words, fear, 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 fear. So the neurochemists tell us that the brain can be thought of in a way as evolutionary from 3 different sort of chapters of evolutionary, so reptilian, mammalian, and sentient. So the reptile brain does the fear thing. Fight, flight, or freeze is absolutely primal. The mammalian brain does the hurt, lonely, sad, ashamed, that part, like the emotional thing. And then those who have this prefrontal cortex have analytical, and we don't know exactly how the dolphin uses this apparatus, but anyway, we sort of can watch how we use it because we hear our crazy monkey mind doing this. My issue and thing to talk about in front of us is that fear is, in that sense, in me and in you, primal. It governs and rules at a way that is very hard to override. And if you scare me, even in an IMAX theater where I can know I'm just wearing the 3D glasses and the object is not careening towards me, but I will have a visceral response like, right? And that's autonomic. It's wired into me. So I'm made to fear. Fear is the easiest thing for me as an organism to do. It's the most natural thing for me to do. And I've heard people say fear and faith can't be in the person at the same time. I totally disagree. I think that what I find is people of faith are able to cope with fear that persists in us because there's no eradicating fear in the organism. But I do think faith is a nice accompaniment to fear. And this may very well be one of the signature pieces that belonging in a faith tradition, saying aims to deliver, that's a turn of a phrase. Because I'm not sure that Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, or Buddhism were devised for a specific purpose. I think they emerge on the landscape of human history. And almost every civilization, context, or whatever, has these wisdom traditions, and it's hard to make generalized statements about the unity of all of them, but there are certain things that we can observe that are underlying similarities and parallels. A couple things to say about that. One is, I used to identify as an atheist, I no longer do, but what I've come to appreciate, I didn't like when people said this when I was an atheist, but I've come to believe atheism is a kind of faith. It's just a faith in the non-existence of God, and in a faith in a certain belief in the role of science, but it's a faith. It's a deep-held conviction. And interestingly, people are sometimes surprised to hear me say, I think atheism can support spirituality and recovery. I think you can stay atheist and do recovery really well. I think you can oddly really do that even in the 12-step world, although many people are like, it was really hard for me to make that up-ramp. But I think it can be done. So, what is the underlying The very first draft that I had this week of a message said that there's something essentially hopeful about prayer, which was an insight that caught me, and I never really thought about it. But I think it's fair to say, like, people who pray are, whether you believe in the pray to a God or not, or, there are lots of wisdom traditions that don't have a theistic formulation, but they do, most of them include something that looks like prayer or meditation. And in the practice of it, I think there's something essentially hopeful. And there's usually an encouragement to do it, especially in foxhole experience. We make fun of people who do foxhole prayers alone, but I don't know, when I'm in stress and difficulty, it's a primary part of my toolkit. And maybe the fact that it emerges for the atheist in the foxhole is a pointer to the way in which it is an expression of our fundamental hopefulness. So, what I was about to say about underlying threads is that if you line up Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Wicca, I'm sure I'm forgetting, I don't mean to offend anybody who I've not named, Taoists, these wisdom bodies and their doctrine and their ritual, there's a lot of diversity. But one of the things I think underlying in common is there is a way in which the form is practiced. So the Muslim here will be encouraged, if they haven't, to get a prayer mat. The Jewish person to go to Shabbos, or maybe explore, if it's within their scope, things like tefillin. The Catholic to maybe consider the rosary. The evangelical Christian to return to scripture. The Hindu to consider yoga. Like there's in all of these things, there's a way to keep your spiritual condition up. There's essentially it's like going to the spirituality gym, and to maintain your spiritual wellness. And I think it's striking that is an underlying commonality. And what it does is it is a alleviator of despair. When you do these practices, you gain connectedness within the body of people who practice in this way. And I think it does help relieve the fundamental primal of the human experience. So, our hope emerges out of what we do more than what we know or read. It is enfleshed and lived and breathed. And practiced one day at a time. We just recently had some folks, and some may still be here in our milieu, who have really wrestled with total despair. I mean, concern about persisting with their lives. And if you have ever been close in your world to somebody who's taken their life, it is a brutal and difficult wound to suffer as a person who has survived. That bomb blast within proximity has come close to me. So I know there's a place where people can get where despair wins. But we are not there today. Hope is alive in this place, and it must be alive in you, or you would not be sitting in the chair or watching the stream. And on this day, when tomorrow the nation remembers people have fought for independence, let us fight also for the victory we have over the adversary in this room, which is the disease of addiction. And let us allow ourselves to believe, as I have come to really believe, that recovery is not only possible, but quite probable. If you follow the recommended course of actions that you are prescribed here as a treatment plan, you can absolutely do very well. And people who struggle, to me it's just there's more to be discovered. But Don't let the struggles of your previous inability to sustain abstinence make you believe that you cannot get well. I have seen miracle after miracle after miracle. People with 10, 15, 17 years of in and out and in and out and in and out, who suddenly are at some meeting talking about having 17 years of continuous sobriety. So I will just not give up on anyone. And I hope that we would adopt that as a posture today. So whatever is the foxhole in which you find yourself, I invite you to journal a little bit of some mythical or very practical idea that will carry you through today and a lot of tomorrow. Thanks very much.